some thoughts on Romans chapter 1, verses 28 through to 32. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through to chapter 3, verse 20, the Apostle Paul is seeking to set out the universal effects of sin, the universal plight of mankind before God, that all are under sin. And in these opening verses, which run from chapter 1, verse 18 through to the end of chapter 1, the principles are established how a people can turn from knowing God, being aware of God, and yet completely rejecting God. If we look at the passage, we will see how the first thing that happens to people in the degeneration of their characters and beings is that they turn away from God. Idolatry comes in. And so we read in verse 21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. They give themselves over to the pursuit of other things, other entities, which take the place of the true God. And so the fact that we are created to have a relationship with God is closed off. People replace that awareness of a need of a relationship with God with all other things, and idolatry comes in, the replacing of God with other entities, people, things, pleasures. And so the first thing that happens in the degeneration of any person and any society is idolatry. And then the degeneration continues with immorality. And so you come to verse 24, as people have chosen to reject God. We come to verse 24, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies amongst themselves. In verse 25, we'll say that that's happened because they've given up on God. Idolatry has come in, and idolatry leads to immorality. This is the way these things progress. And so the immorality is focused on sexual deviance. We are called to sexual purity. That's one man, one woman, to the exclusion of all others, for sexual engagement with marriage, within marriage and nowhere else. But here we see immorality coming in, and people are dishonoring God with their bodies. And then we'll see that in verses 26 to 27 how that develops to a homosexual sexual deviance, as people choose to lust towards those of the same sex. They do that which is against nature, which is opposed to natural relations. End of verse 26, the things that are contrary to nature. And so you see this degeneration that's taking place, and we as we come from idolatry into immorality. And then the passage which we specifically want to concentrate on is in verses 28 through to 32, how that then leads to injustice. It leads to a society which is reflective of injustice. In a just society, people treat others in the way that they should do. Everybody is given due acknowledgement for who they are and what they should have. When injustice comes in, that is lost, and people are no longer treated in the way that they should be, or no longer honored in the way that they should be. And so we see injustice, and you see all these words in verse 28 through to verse 31 tumble on top of each other. You see, God has given them up, verse 28, to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. And so there's all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, grabbing for yourself what doesn't belong to you, grabbing for yourself things in order to get meaning. Malice, there is a hardness, there is a bitterness. So that's full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, all these things which are seeking to have what is for myself and not caring about what others have. Gossip, slanderers, haters of God, as we move from verse 29 into verse 30. It's almost in passing that the term is thrown in, haters of God, but there we are. That's at the heart of it. People have set themselves to hate God. They're insolent. They have no respect for proper order of things, and they will speak and act without respect. Haughty and boastful, 2 words reflecting a prideful attitudes. Inventors of evil, they concoct different ways of doing evil. Disobedient to parents, disrespecting that primary bond in any society. Foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Hardness in the pursuit of things that are against God. Here is a society which is really in free fall. Here is a society which is collapsing. Here is a society which is killing itself. Here is a society which is in its death throes, we might say. And it is the society that has turned away from God. Remember these 3 eyes, the 3 eyes of sin, the 3 eyes that give description to the reality of sin and waywardness: idolatry, immorality, injustice. And as a general rule, idolatry is the first that's introduced to corrupt humanity, and then that goes into immorality and injustice. People say, why are Christians so interested in what goes on in people's private bedrooms? Well, Romans 1 would indicate that when a society has turned away from purity in the sexual mores, then it is heading for meltdown. It is heading for this degeneration. And so these are sobering things. So we should be concerned what people are doing in the sexual realm, because when there is impurity, then there will be injustice. And so finally in verse 32, Paul would observe that people do know these things are wrong. There's something inside of us, conscience, an awareness inside of us, going back perhaps we might say to verse 19, which tells us about there's an awareness of God. Creation gives a declaration about God, and that is confirmed in our inner beings, that there's an awareness of God, a God who is good. And verse 19 says, what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. And people turn away from God, and they say they know there is a God, and they know that these things shouldn't be practiced, but they do it all the same, and they encourage others to do it. And I'm persuaded that these things are so very up to date and so very relevant as regards to our own present situation. Sobering words, aren't they? And the background to all this is the fundamental need that we're all aware of sin. We're all aware that we need help. We're in a terrible, terrible plight. And that will lead us on to the teaching which is introduced from Romans 3, verse 21 onwards, about the righteousness from God through Christ and through Christ alone. So that's some thoughts on Romans chapter 1, verses 28 through to 32. Thank you.